ad astra per aspera, to the stars through difficulty. You know, it's got to be one of the most powerful state mottos in the entire country. And it's not just some nice-sounding phrase. It is the absolute core, the very essence of the story of Kansas, a state that was literally born from a violent struggle for freedom that would go on to define America itself. See, before the big Civil War tore the country apart, a smaller, much more personal, and absolutely brutal war was fought right on the prairies of Kansas. A war over a single fundamental question. So how on earth did this one piece of land become the crucible for the entire nation? Well, let's dig in. Okay, so to really get a grip on this story, we have to go back. Way, way back. Long before it was ever called Kansas, and centuries before Europeans showed up, this was a land with a deep, rich history and some pretty amazing civilizations. And this timeline, wow, it really gives you a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about here. I mean, we're going from Paleo-Indian hunters tracking mammoths, all the way to the sophisticated city builders of the Wichita people, then the first Spanish explorers showing up, and finally it becoming part of the U.S. Thousands of years of human history. And you've got to understand, this was not empty land. Back in the 1400s, the Wichita people built a city called Etzanoa, and its population is estimated to have been around 20,000 people. Now think about that. That was bigger than a lot of European cities at the same time. A huge, thriving hub of civilization right in the heart of North America. All right, but let's jump forward. The story that really puts Kansas on the map, the one most of us know, it all kicks off in the 1850s. This is when a single political decision made in Washington, D.C., turned this territory into a live-action, high-stakes proving ground for the future of the entire country. So here's the deal. It all comes down to this one piece of legislation, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Before this, the Missouri Compromise had drawn a clear line across the country, basically saying no slavery in new northern territories. Well, this act just wiped that line off the map. It introduced this idea of popular sovereignty, which meant, hey, let the settlers who move there vote and decide for themselves. It sounded pretty democratic, right? But what it really did was light a fuse. And the result? Well, it was a mad dash. You had two groups, polar opposites, just flooding into the territory. On one side were the Free Staters. Many were hardcore abolitionists from New England, with organizations funding them to make sure Kansas would be a free state. And on the other side, the Border Ruffians, pro-slavery folks from neighboring Missouri who crossed the border to stuff ballot boxes and use intimidation to make Kansas a slave state. So when these two groups collided, man, it was instant. And it was violent. This whole period from about 1855 to 58 got a nickname that honestly couldn't be more perfect: Bleeding Kansas. This wasn't some formal war with armies. It was a nasty, brutal series of ambushes, raids, and political killings that was like a terrifying preview of the Civil War. The violence just went to a whole new level in May of 1856. A pro-slavery mob, technically led by a sheriff, swarmed the town of Lawrence, which was basically the capital of the Free State movement. They weren't just protesting, they burned down the Free State Hotel, smashed abolitionist printing presses, and ran wild through the town. It was a shocking attack. And the payback? It was just as brutal, and it came fast. A few days later, enter the radical abolitionist John Brown, a guy who believed he was an instrument of God's wrath. He led a small group of his followers in the middle of the night, dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their cabins near Pottawatomie Creek, and hacked them to death with broadswords. It was a horrifying massacre that shocked everyone and just threw gasoline on the fire. So you've got all this bloodshed happening on the ground, but at the same time, there's this insane political war being fought over the state's founding document. It's just a dizzying back and forth. The Free Staters would write an anti-slavery constitution, but pro-slavery forces in D.C. would block it. Then the official pro-slavery government would ram through their own version, but Congress would reject it because it was so obviously fraudulent. 4 different constitutions in 4 years. It just shows you how completely broken and divided the situation was. But eventually, after all that chaos, the Free State settlers started to win out. They had the numbers, and they had the persistence. With the Wyandotte Constitution finally accepted, Kansas was ready to put its bloody territorial days behind it and start a new chapter as a full-fledged frontier state. So on January 29, 1861, it's official. Kansas enters the Union as a free state. But here's the thing. There was zero time to celebrate. Just a few months later, the Civil War breaks out, and Kansas, which had already fought its own war over slavery, jumped into the fight on the side of the Union without a moment's hesitation. After the Civil War, Kansas transforms all over again. The railroad comes through, and suddenly it's the crossroads of America. Cattle drives coming up from Texas end in legendary cow towns like Abilene and Dodge City, creating that iconic image of the Wild West we all know, with lawmen like Wyatt Earp and outlaws like the Dalton Gang. And this is so important. Kansas became this beacon of hope for thousands of formerly enslaved African Americans, called exodusters, who came seeking real freedom and a chance to own their own land. But, the fights in Kansas weren't always person against person. For the thousands of farmers who poured in to settle the state, the real battle was often against the land itself and against powerful economic forces that they felt were crushing them. And man, this quote from a newspaper editor at the time, William Allen White, it just nails the feeling. Farmers in the late 1800s felt totally squeezed by the railroads and the banks. This anger gave rise to the populist movement, a massive political uprising of regular folks against what they saw as big money corporate interests. It was a political prairie fire that started in Kansas and spread across the country. And then came the 1930s, and with it, what might have been the ultimate trial, the Dust Bowl. A decade of crippling drought hit right as the Great Depression was strangling the economy. Topsoil turned to dust and blew away in monstrous black blizzards. Can you imagine? It was a true catastrophe, forcing families to either leave everything behind or try to endure the unthinkable. It tested the will of Kansans to its absolute breaking limit. But the ones who held on, the ones who survived, they came out the other side into a whole new century, one that would see Kansas change yet again, moving from farming to industry and, believe it or not, right back to the center of the nation's fight for justice. World War II was a huge catalyst for this change, and you can see it so clearly in this chart. The demand for war supplies, especially airplanes built in Wichita, the air capital of the world, just sparked an industrial explosion. Look at the shift. As manufacturing jobs shot up, farm employment went down. This pulled people off the farms and totally remade the state's economy for the modern age. And this is where the story of Kansas just feels so complete, like it's come full circle. Almost exactly 100 years after the fight to become a free state, Kansas was once again at the heart of America's struggle for freedom. The landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, started right here in Topeka. It was this case that declared school segregation unconstitutional, a huge turning point in the civil rights movement that changed the entire nation. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, you see this one theme over and over and over again, a constant journey through unbelievable hardship toward a higher goal. Think about it. The state was literally born in the fires of bleeding Kansas. It was toughened up by the chaos of the frontier and the sheer economic ruin of the Dust Bowl. And it played this central role in the moral fight to end racial segregation. Every single one of these was a massive difficulty, an asper. And that brings us right back where we started. Ad astra per aspera. It's not just some fancy Latin phrase. It's the biography of a state. It's the profound recognition that for Kansas, the path forward, the path to freedom, the path to the stars has always, always been through difficulty. Hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, we've got a whole playlist of U.S. state histories you should definitely check out. And, of course, subscribe to Notebook Summaries so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for hanging out with us.